Fashioning Counterpublics, the Umblaselo as Urban Archive. I'm Erica de Greef, and I am a curator, author, and academic working collaboratively to explore sites of fashion at the intersection of modes of power, resilience, and resistance in South Africa, both in the past and present, to imagine and enable diverse and indigenous futures. My work prompts critical and creative attention towards the possibilities of redress and reimagination in African fashion studies. I'm a founding member of the African Fashion Research Institute, the South African Fashion Journal, and the Refashion Lab. Erasure and absence has haunted the writing of South African fashion and its histories. Drawing on my readings of post-apartheid contemporary fashion, such as in the work of Clive Rundle and others, I argue that their work carries the traces of the past, of memories. I've been curious to read these signifying traces, not only in the work of designers, but also in streetwear and local subcultures and across museum collections. In the same way that Ferdinand de Jong and David Murphy propose a reading of the post-colonial city as archive, I approach contemporary post-colonial and post-apartheid fashion as archive, with traces that can contribute to a remapping of past narratives and rethinking and rewriting of fashion lineages. My first engagement with the Umblaselo was as a student of fashion in Durban in the fraught and politically turbulent late 1980s. Considering the agency of fashion to resist political segregation and to disrupt the ordering of raced bodies in public, I was drawn to mixed urban cultural spaces, such as Durban's beachfront or Grey Street's Madrasa Arcade, or the informal markets in Albert Road. Political and cultural freedoms were being fashioned and articulated as hybrid countercultural visual aesthetics. Fashion was simultaneously an embodied site of resistance, with the public proliferation of protest t-shirts, and a collective site for navigating the alternate ideologies of a counter-public. 20 years later, in the early 2000s, I found myself as a lecturer at a fashion school in Johannesburg, grappling with students' struggle to know and engage with their local fashion practices and histories. The complete erasure of African fashion histories and absence of contemporary representation in the fashion canon, including the global media and museum collections, meant that students were denied access to a language and understanding of local fashion archives. This inspired me to interrogate the ongoing violence of coloniality in institutions such as museums for my PhD in African Studies, where a repressive and silencing discourse on the African sartorial objects and related practices persists. It was here that I was able to work on archival objects in the museum's collections, including a number of pairs of embellished trousers called ibulukwe. Albeit of Xhosa origin, I would argue that they are the sartorial relatives of the Umblaselo. In 2019, an opportunity arose for me to engage with the dynamics of belonging, erasure, and resistance through fashion, with a retrospective exhibition at Zuid-Marke titled 21 Years Making History with South African Fashion Week. The inclusion of a pair of Umblaselo by streetwear brand Lokshin Culture disrupted an otherwise largely hegemonic Western historicity, one that dominates global fashion narratives. The Umblaselo's presence in the exhibition not only unsettled the expectations of a global fashion chronology, it voiced the genealogy of a decentered and alternate politics of being, largely denied in museums. The trousers called forth memories of migrant labor, of urban-rural relations, and of familial objects, and invited into dialogue another pair of Umblaselo, a patchwork pair of well-worn Levi's. Stored in its seams and scuffs were traces of ritual, resistance, resilience, and reimagined selfhood. As archive, they exceed disciplinary classifications and offer a rich locus for reading an entangled politics of the city, nation, culture, and enfolded individual agencies.
Davidson was an apartheid urbanization project. Situated 50 kilometers from Johannesburg, it came from the same milieu of racial dominance and class divides as happened in Euro-America in the 20th century. Davidson's blueprint, the planning and building of which began in the 1950s, carries forth ideas of divided governance and separatist imaginations of nationalist states of modernity. Most of the people that found themselves here, a place that is called urban, yet is still so far from any real metropolitan area or major economic activity, came in search of minimum wage work and in pursuit of medical, financial, or social securities. Displaced by relocation and stringent policies enforced by the apartheid government, people here had to re-image themselves into modernity and beyond, with limited resources and no space or place to call their own but a portion of land to rent. Their hard-earned incomes were paid to the colonizers who, through violent systemic methods, had seized and continued to own the land that had once belonged to the ancestors of those now forced to pay rent. Despite all of this, Davidson is witness to tenacity, brilliance, creative ingenuity, communal coalitions, and powerful resilience that flips the script, disrupting the disavowals, difficulties imposed on its residents. 28 years after the promise of a new South African democracy, the power of fashion as a site of creative resistance and critical self-making presents a counter-narrative to the ongoing dehumanizing effects of apartheid on black bodies. I created an Instagram platform called Davidson 1520 and use it as a discursive portal to highlight my thoughts about the many obscured histories of individuals and everyday resistance that I am privy to observe. In each post, I engage politics, using fashion thinking as both a lens and a method. I place fashion in the politics of memory because fashion speaks. It tells others how we think about ourselves in relation to our environment. It positions us in space and across time, and it is the fabric of our embodiment. I am interested in how the urban is both enacted and remembered in Davidson. Sunday best, for example, is a refusal to show up for godliness with the everyday second-hand clothes that we used and were housed in. It is a performance of dressing up as ritual that overcomes our second-hand violence. It is the ritual of self-love, of restoration, of self-appraisal. It is curating the self away from and beyond the degradation of everyday blackness disseminated by apartheid. Dress in Davidson messes with and destabilizes the frameworks that were constructed to define, delineate, and spatialize race, culture, and class. Fashioning the self through and beyond apartheid, exploitation, and the radical violence of the displaced becomes a form of therapy. It is not the association with brands from the global north necessarily, but the act of dressing up that can be likened to channeling trauma from within. People say, thank God I don't look like my problems. It is this use of fashion likened to paintbrushes that helps us deal with, channel and get rid of destructive emotions associated with the violence of the marginal. Being curated reimagines the black body as a site of reflection, catharsis, and beauty. Self-fashioning appropriates power from the oppressor in order to educate the oppressed about the potential to redress and recollect. Fashion in Davidson redefines public spaces such as soccer fields, streets, car washes, and churches as galleries of hope displaying the conceptual migration of self into the world and as a counterpublic contesting what has been imposed by politics, power, and panopticism. Act Davidson 1520 serves as a parallel discursive arena, following Nancy Fraser's conception of subordinated social groups who, quote, invent and circulate counter-discourses, which in turn permit them to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs, close quote. Umblaselo is one of a range of African sartorial practices that have imagined and crafted expressive forms of resilient selfhood configured in response to ongoing exclusion felt and lived within the wider politics and the aesthetics of the international. These subversions of sartorial codes are similar to the fashioning tactics seen in global politics and deployed by politicians such as Ghanaian Kwame Nkrumah and South African Nelson Mandela. Yet, Umblaselo is played out, not on the global political stage of hypervisibility, but grounded in the everyday and performed in the realm of the ordinary. Here in Davidton, Patrick Shabalala shares his style narratives and inserts an embodied practice of time, place, history, and memory, one that references and gives shape to multiple and interconnecting worlds, into his contemporary urban aesthetic. In this way, the archive lives through Umblaselo. Shabalala believes that Umblaselo is one of many indigenous luxury items that act as archives passed down from one generation. The knowledges they carry preserve the black self in the modern world. They contest power, and they fashion black resistance and black re-existence. Geographer Rashad Shabazz explores how the policing, surveillance, and architectures of confinement were used to specialize blackness in Chicago, and how fashion could be deployed to navigate alternate black identities in liminal spaces. Streetwear and cultural practices perform the reclamation of self in these spaces. Shabalala adds that certain fashions and certain colors represent protection in the presence of guardian angels, and an intention to reconnect with and live by precepts formed in pre-colonial times. In this sense, fashion is the archive of our transient memories, an embodied classroom of the past. Shabalala points to the red as the color for fighting spiritual battles. Green and blue represent paternal and maternal lineages, retaining them in remembrance and paying homage to ancestral pioneers as stylistic and wearable forms. These material signifiers reinsert stories, not recorded, yet remembered. By using yellow, Shabalala adds, means that the wearer invites the presence of forces that preserve us whilst we are subjected to harsh realities created by colonization and other forms of slavery. In this case, Umblaselo, bearing symbolic resemblance of divine protection and connection to ancestry and divinity away from the church or Western conceptions of godliness and goodliness, is a restoration of indigenous and other ways of being in the modern world, often relegated to the traditional. Certain garments that are closely associated with culture carry the transient memories of who we used to be, not as a location past, but one that has passed. According to Shabalala, the leopard reminds wearers of their power in a world where they have been disenfranchised, disorganized, and disavowed. We argue that Umblaselo reconsecrates the mind for the body and the body for the mind as a speculative decolonial praxis or decolonial perspective of selfhood, carrying spiritual and social significance that allows black people to connect to divine sources of inspiration and power, as well as creating passages to the future. Fashion is the decolonial lens with which to envisage black cultural, intellectual, and political excellence. Material and at times messy, Umblaselo offers decentered urban archive that captures an everyday record, an experience, a feeling, a memory of the practices that inextricably constitute an African palimpsest of different sorts of politics, one that is manifested beyond the capitalist logics of a Western fashion ontology.